Currently, our club has 14 living past presidents. They are Don Chatham, Susan Haynes, Bruce Boyer, David Mann, Steve Tomaszewski, Junie Simpson, Michael Thompson, Jim Tomes, Tom Joyce, Bob Cotner, Hayward Blake, Arthur Miller, and Ken Nebenthal. Each of these possess what qualifies as a PhD in leadership: persistence, honor, and dedication. They have persistence tempered by patience, honor blended with a sense of humor, and dedication with the daring necessary to push our club forward to the next century. But beyond this, they have all worn this mantle well, because it takes a great deal to be determined to be the leader of the Caxton Club. Each of these presidents have guided our club to ensure its continuing success, and we have much to thank them for. And tonight, we award new name badges to mark their distinctive service, and we are offering note cards designed with the logo created by no less than Hayward Blake as a mark of this distinction. In a few moments, you are all going to be receiving, or have received, I'll let the waiters give me a clue here. How are we doing? Dan, you should start to pass out these name badges and note cards. We are going to have a toast to our past presidents, because they have all worked long and hard to achieve this distinction. Bruce, you can send me a note.
This is for real?
This is for real.
I'm not. Way beyond the most.
Is the champagne all poured?
It's coming.
It's coming. Okay.
Process.
Are the note cards available for sale?
That would be such a commercial request at a solemn moment like this. But talk to me later. Are we done? One more table? Okay. All right, and now we'd like to give a toast to all our past presidents. Thank you for your service, and humor everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the woman who will be introducing our speaker, none other than my co-chair and the Newberry representative, Alice Schreier.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Alice Schreier, the Roger and Julie Vasquez Vice President for Collections and Library Services here at the Newberry. So as you know, if you've been upstairs or if you can look at what's on the screen, tonight's program focuses on the Kurt Teich Postcard Archives collection, which was donated to the Newberry by the Lake County Forest Preserve District just 1 year ago to the month. The collection included, when it arrived, 2.5 million postcards, and it consists of the corporate archive of the Kurt Teich Printing Company and several separate postcard collections formed by individual collectors and added to the Teich archives while it was located at the Lake County Discovery Museum in Wauconda, Illinois, where it was donated in the early 1980s. The collection was donated to the Newberry in preparation for the move of the Discovery Museum to Libertyville, and we're thrilled to have it and honored to have it. The collection provides rich visual documentation for several of the Newberry's strongest collections: maps, travel and tourism, local and family history, Chicago and the Midwest, printing history, graphic design, and advertising history, as well as major trends and events over the course of the 20th century, such as World's Fairs and Expositions, World Wars I and II, the atomic bomb, fashion, food, and many other topics. Many Newberry staff members who are Caxtonians and volunteers, including Paul Gale and Rob Carlson, have spent countless hours since the collection arrived to make it available to researchers. So I hope tonight its introduction will inspire many of you to come explore and use it. I had the pleasure of working with tonight's speaker, Katherine Hamilton Smith, and her wonderful colleagues at the Lake County Discovery Museum and the Forest Preserve District over the course of arranging this magnificent gift. During the process and beyond, Katherine provided encouragement, expertise, and guidance. I cannot thank her enough for her continuing support of the Newberry as the new home for this collection, and it's a great pleasure to introduce her as tonight's speaker. Katherine is Director of Public Affairs and Development for the Lake County Forest Preserve District. Before taking on her current position in 2015, she served in several capacities within the district, most recently as Director of Cultural Resources. Most significantly for us tonight, for more than 2 decades, Katherine managed and developed the Teich archives. She oversaw the organization, preservation, and use of the collection and promoted it with passion and expertise. She also worked with private collectors, many of whose collections were donated to the Teich archives because of her work with them and are now here at the Newberry. The visibility of the Teich archives and the respect among scholars and collectors of the research value of postcards is in large part due to Katherine's tireless advocacy. Throughout her career, Katherine has been a leader in professional organizations related to archives and museums. She currently serves on the Illinois Historic Sites Advisory Council and on the Libertyville Historic Preservation Commission. She is past chair of the Illinois State Archives Advisory Board, past chair of the Visual Materials section of the Society of American Archivists, past editor of the Society for Commercial Archaeology Journal, and a recipient of the Curator of the Year Award for the state of Illinois. And she's a member of the American Alliance of Museums and a certified archivist. Katherine received her bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Nebraska and attended St. Andrews University in Scotland, where she studied art and music history. She holds a master's degree in art and music history from the University of Chicago. A native Nebraskan, she lives in Liberty with her 2 sons, and in her so-called spare time, she is an artist and a writer. Please welcome our speaker, Katherine Hamilton Smith.
It's just so funny to hear all that, like listed. Thank you so much for inviting me, Jackie Vossler. I don't know where you are. There you are. Thank you so much. Jackie and I have worked together for the last couple of months, just putting together all the logistical things about this evening and my coming this evening, what I would speak about. It's just an honor to be here, an honor to be at the Newberry Library, and an honor to be addressing the Caxton Club. My remarks this evening are going to touch a little bit on the general significance of postcards, as well as on the specific development of a little bit on the history of the Teich company, and on the specific development of the Teich postcard archives, which is now at the Newberry Library. I will say that in preparation for my coming to champion postcards as an important document of 20th century culture, my specialty is in early medieval manuscript illumination, specifically in the 20 years after the Norman conquest of England. So that prepared me very well for answering an ad in the Chicago Tribune, and this is in 1982, so that was how you got a job, as you looked in the Chicago Tribune under artist, and there, cheek by jowl, under archivist, was a very short listing for a person needed to catalog postcards. And I followed that up, I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, and so drove from Hyde Park all the way up to Libertyville, Illinois, which in 1982 was very rural, and it was a long trip, and it seemed a long trip not only in miles but also intellectually to come from where I was seated thinking about 11th century manuscript illumination and then thinking about getting a job cataloging postcards. But it was intriguing enough, and maybe there is a connection, because both of them are small images intended to draw attention to something specific, and in that commonality, maybe there is some sort of a connection. There's a connection of art, there's a connection of language, there's a connection of communication, ideas, and images, all wrapped in one. So I do think that somehow those do circle around and meet at some point. Let's see. I start my presentation this evening with something that looks very much like a postcard, but if you think about it, it's not quite the 3.5 by 5.5 inches of a postcard shape. And this is not a postcard. But postcards are nestled very strongly in a heritage of early chromolithography and decorated envelopes and letter writing paper. And that's what you see here is a decorated envelope. This one of Washington, D.C., probably in the 1860s. It would have been accompanied likely, you would have bought it when you were visiting Washington, it would have been accompanied likely with decorated writing paper. This one is from Bournemouth. You can see the date right in the middle there of 1861. And this was printed in 1855. And the person who writes here we actually know the story of this person. It's in England, in Bournemouth, and she's writing to her brother, who is George, and she's saying that she's been meaning to write for a long time, but she was waiting till she could get a piece of writing paper that had a pretty picture on it that would tell something about where she was visiting in Bournemouth, and she actually puts an X right up here where their house is, up on the cliff. This is all part of that mid-19th century tourism of the common person who would be going not on the grand tour of Europe necessarily, but to more local places. Maybe she lives in London and she's going to Bournemouth for the sea air. Actually, we do know that this young girl was doing that very thing. She died of consumption a year after this letter was written. But those unfortunate circumstances aside, this is a confluence of place, of communication, of connection between the writer and the person to whom the message is addressed, and a picture. It all immediately predates the phenomenon of postcards by only a few years. And it's also part of that mid-19th century phenomenon of the growth of chromolithography, especially to communicate news, but also to communicate experience and how it became accessible to a common person. It was not expensive to purchase any longer. You could purchase something like a piece of decorated writing paper and use it not at a whim, but a little bit more accessibly than previously. So that was printed in 1855, that particular piece was written in 1861, and now we jump to 1889, because the first, postcards, the invention of postcards is greatly, not by all of you, but greatly debated about who, was it in Germany, was it in Austria, was it in Italy? You know, you actually sort of don't know, because they crawled onto the international scene in a way. The very, very first postcards were printed and distributed by the post offices themselves. So what we're talking about really with the Teich archives is the advent of the common picture postcard, which is a little bit different from the postcards printed by post offices around the world and made accessible to users of the Postal Service. This particular one you're looking at is actually printed in 1890, but the very first postcards as we know them today, with a picture of a place and a space for the writing, were printed in Paris in 1889 for the Paris Exposition, and that was the year that the Eiffel Tower was completed. Those postcards were printed by the French newspaper Le Figaro, and you could only purchase them if you ascended the Eiffel Tower, which at that time was the tallest human-made structure in the world. So it was a great phenomenon and a great experience to do that. And at the top of the towers, you can still do today, and I'll comment on that in a minute. But you could buy a postcard, buy a stamp, and there was a post office there, as there is still today, where you could post that postcard. Those are thought of as the first picture postcards as we know them today. Well, I'll go back quickly and show you this huge blank space off to the right is intended for your message, because in the early days of picture postcards, that's all you could write. You could not write a message on what's referred to actually as the verso by the post office of a postcard, which is the business side, basically, the front side, is only reserved in those early days for the stamp and the address. You could not write any message on it. You had to write your message on the recto, or really the B side of the postcard, which was the picture side at that time. And consequently, these early postcards that were written in the first decade and a half of picture postcards are just covered with text. And there's some really great examples of Victorian cross writing, where they would write on one way, and then they would write another way, and they would write diagonally, so that in this little space, it took you all afternoon to just make it out. Oops. So we're jumping from the very first picture postcards in the world, those printed for the Exposition 1889 in Paris, to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And this is another wonderful reason why it's excellent that the Teich Archives, the world's largest public collection of picture postcards, is in Chicago, because the 10 postcards published by Charles W. Goldsmith in 1893 for the World's Columbian Exposition are thought of as the first American picture postcards, in the same vein as those published a few years earlier in Paris. And this is one of them. It was a set of 10, and Goldsmith actually got a special dispensation from the post office to be able to do this, to be able to print a picture postcard like this with the postal imprint on the back. And those are all, the set of 10 are in the collection here at the Newberry. I'm going to comment very briefly on Kurt Teich and the Kurt Teich Company. You see Kurt Otto Teich here in front of you. He's 18 years old in this picture. His father came to the World's Columbian Exposition from Lobenstein in Germany in 1893, and he went back, he spent some months here and then went back to Germany and told his sons that there was a lot of opportunity in Chicago, as did so many people following their visit to the World's Columbian Exposition. And the Teich family was no different. He came back and said to his sons, you should go to Chicago, you can start a business there. The Teich family in Lobenstein had been in the printing trade for many generations previously. So it wasn't unusual that one of the sons went into printing. The other two sons, though, did come here, and they all made great successes of themselves. One was a hotelier. Max Teich was a hotelier here in Chicago. And then another of the sons went down to Texas and became a very famous sculptor and is responsible for all of the large figurative sculptures in the Texas state capitol. So these were three not common young men, it seems to me. And they all took their father's instruction and encouragement and came to the United States. In this picture, this was taken the year that Kurt came to Chicago. He was 18 years old. He was born in 1877. And this young man started out he formed a company called the Kurt Teich Company, and they were a jobber printer for a number of years before he came upon the idea of this new fad of picture postcards. So he's not the inventor of the American picture postcard by any means, but he is certainly a pioneer of the phenomenon of picture postcards, not only in the United States, but in the world. There is a bit of a fish story that's told in the Teich family, but it's got to have a kernel of truth, as all fish stories do, and that is that once he was in the printing business here in Chicago for a few years, he got the idea, as I said, of jumping on the bandwagon of picture postcards, and he took that idea and a camera himself and went along a train line leaving from Chicago, went down to the American southeast, down to Florida, and traveled all the way back to Chicago, and then continued on his journey, came back, and every time the train would stop, he would get off, so he's following the train line, not a specific train, and go into the town. Let's say it's Decatur, Illinois. And he goes into the town and sees what's what. He sees the new Oriental Revival Bandstand. He sees that there's a new Carnegie Library. He takes a view up Main Street, and he takes a view down Main Street with his camera. And then he goes to whatever the likely local retailer would be, like I don't know if there'd be Five and Dime at that time, but the drugstore, and tries to interest them in this new idea of picture postcards of that town. Not of something exotic or special or distant, but of their home. And he was successful doing that, and the fish story comes in because it's said that he came back with $30,000 worth of orders, which in 1901, that's a lot of money, and he was in business. And he sort of never looked back. He continued to do a few things. I noticed one of the folks who was upstairs looking at the exhibition picked up one of the beer coasters. And I know Alice said, yes, that is from the Teich Company. They did continue to make little odds and ends. I think they still had like one tiny pinky toe. Yeah, Halloween noisemakers, one pinky toe left in jobber print, or anything that comes through the door will print it for you. But by and large, that trip flipped the switch, and he really never looked back. This is a view of the third and final of the three buildings in which the Teich Company had its home here in Chicago. This is on Irving Park in Ravenswood. It is still there. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's called Postcard Place. And it was at one time condominiums and one time apartments, but in any case, it's residential at this point. But you can still see that if you travel on the North Line that goes up to Lake Forest, you go right past this building. You can still see the ghost sign on the west side of the building that says Kurt Teich Direct Mail Postcards on the top of the building. A view of the first offset press, not in the building I just showed you, but in the building previous to it in 1910. That is not Kurt Teich, it's just a press. Shouldn't say just a pressman, especially not to a group like the Caxton. But this is a pressman. Eventually, though, in the early 1930s, they had a press floor with, I think it was 17 Heidelberg presses, and one of them was an enormous Heidelberg press. Kurt Teich was very secretive about any press innovation, any technological innovation was made, and so we don't have a lot of records about the company itself. But they went from this, which is their first offset press, to an enormous ability to just pump out pictures of the United States and other places as well. But we kind of are at a saturation point with this company alone of pictorial images of how the United States changed in the 20th century. And this is a typical one. This was printed by the Teich company probably about 1910, 1909 of Coopersville, Michigan. I could have chosen any image whatsoever, but this is what they published in the tens of thousands. Not only a single view at a single point in time, but continued to develop those relationships with the towns and to print pictures of the towns as they changed in the 20th century. And I show you one other picture. This one actually is not a postcard, it's an actual photograph, but it's of Half Day, Illinois, which is right up in the Chicago suburbs, not too far from Libertyville, where I currently live. This was also taken in 1910. So just pause for a moment and think about 1910 and 2017 and the difference in those 2 years. It is like an entirely different world. And that is one of the things that makes picture postcards of place so important and so special. They saturated the market with views of just everyday places as they changed through the first about 6 or 7 decades of the century, which is when they changed most enormously until maybe arguably today. So it's the place, it's the common place, it's the average place, it's not the special place that makes postcards so special. I show you this in Pullman, Illinois, for exactly the same reason. They weren't just street scenes. Remember that I described that first trip of him going, stopping along the train line and looking up Main Street and down Main Street and the new bandstand or whatever was new. But he also drummed up business from individual business owners. This is a bank in Pullman, Illinois. I'm quite certain that the client was the Pullman Trust and Savings Bank. And again, it goes exactly to the heart of the comment I just made about why postcards are so special, is because in a sense they were not special. This might be the only picture of the interior of this bank in Pullman, Illinois at this point in time. And it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists among its comrades of images of every town and every city and every interior. And I use every in quotations. I don't mean to say that obviously everything has been photographed. But the everyness of how much was photographed through this one format of visual documentation is, I think, quite astounding. On the individual level, it's nothing. But in the aggregate, it's an important and really the only document of its type of how the United States changed in the 20th century. So there are lots of much, much more charming than places and postcards that the Teich company and other companies like the Teich company printed. This one is a special favorite of mine because it shows sort of a microcosm of early auto tourism, where you have a little map and you have a cutaway of what kind of amenities you would have in this extraordinarily charming cabin, and there you are. You're going to Portland, Oregon, and you're going to do it through a road trip in the early 1920s. So this goes also to a strength of the Newberry's collection, which is travel and tourism, and dovetails very nicely with the Rand McNally collection, which has come in recent years. This one's from 1939. Again, now that I don't work with the Teich archives, I get to choose any favorite that I like from all the digital images that I have. But the cool motor gasoline station is just a favorite. This is a so-called linen card. That was a term that the Teich company used, and it's just because the paper stock that they used had that kind of linen-like impression in it that made it look like linen. But linen cards are also known for the vibrancy of their color, the saturated color. And Kurt Teich was especially protective of the technology that he and his company developed around getting that saturated color look of those linen cards. Another thing that was captured in... oh, you have a pumpkin pie fan right down here in the front row. This is Pumpkin Pie Day in Longmont, Colorado, and I will tell you that they still do Pumpkin Pie Day in Longmont, Colorado. I have looked this up. If you go on their website today, you can go there in the fall and go to Pumpkin Pie Day. It's a big community event and has been for 100 years. But this is another aspect of what postcards recorded. I have a few other examples of it coming up here, is events and community connectivity and community traditions. It's a good night to show this picture, I think. This is actually not a Teich company card. This is you see it down in the lower left-hand side. That's another Chicago printer, the V.O. Hammond Company, and the Newberry collection also has a V.O. Hammond collection that came with the Teich archives. But I show you this to indicate, now I'm going to get into a section of my presentation where I'll give you examples of the breadth of what was captured beyond just images, shouldn't say just, but images of place, but images of other things in the American 20th century. So this is the 1906 Chicago Cubs, and to be fair to everybody, I have no idea what your affiliation is. This is the 1906 White Sox. And another Chicago favorite, just to give you a sense that the Teich Company was in business until 1978. So they continued to print postcards long after the golden age of postcards was over. But it was their stock in trade by that point, and so they captured a lot of manifestations of culture in what they printed. So this image, lest you think that, I know you wouldn't think, but lest you think that all postcards are charming and lighthearted and wonderful, they are not. And this was printed by the Teich Company. It would have been printed in 1923, I think this is. I can't see the number in the upper left-hand corner, but does anyone know the phrase "tell 'em we're rising"? Just by show of hands. Anyone? Well, I didn't either, so. I mean, I did once I looked it up and once I started working for the Teich archives, but it's an interesting image, isn't it? I mean, it's very provocative. You wonder what that means. So "Tell 'em we're rising" relates to a story associated with the African-American leader Richard Robert Wright. And in the immediate Civil War period, Richard Robert Wright was born in 1855. So in 1868, so he was only 13, right? I think so. The Union General, just a few years after the conclusion of the Civil War, the Union General, O.O. Howard, had gone down to the South during the Reconstruction period and was addressing an assembly of the community in Atlanta. And he just asked the assembled what message he should take back up to the North with him from the youth of the South. And Richard Robert Wright, a young African-American boy, was in the audience, and he called out, "Tell 'em we're rising." And this became Richard Robert Wright's lifelong motto, and it inspired James Greenleaf Whittier's poem Howard at Atlanta, which tells a little bit of the story of this incident. And the call, this "Tell 'em we're rising," further inspired and motivated a whole generation in the 1920 and immediate post-1920 period of young African Americans as they struggled to figure out what their place was in this country. Oh, there is a question. Oh.
So this was a postcard.
It's a postcard.
And presumably it was targeted to African Americans.
Well, the question is, this is a postcard printed by the Teich Company, and the answer to that is yes. And then the further question is, so was this targeted to the African American? Who's the audience? Basically, is what you're asking. And thank you for asking that question, because it goes directly to an important piece of why the Kurt Teich Company archives, which is the nucleus of what is now at the Newberry Library, why it's so important. And that is that the Teich Company became the world's largest volume producer of picture postcards. And during that time, they regarded anything that came in the door as a job. And so I call the industrial archives that is present in the Kurt Teich Company collection an uncurated collection, or it is a broadly curated collection in that the people who were the clients, who are the United States, brought themselves to the table and had a picture postcard printed. So I don't know what the audience for this specific image was. I don't know that. And I don't think we have the job file for this. It's a little bit too early.
We don't know who the client was.
We don't know who the client was. That's right. But it's important to note that we have that what exists in the Teich archives and the fact that it was all saved card by card by job by job by card by card by job by job is that the people of the United States who would have come to this huge publisher to print postcards of whatever it was, they just printed them. And so we may not understand who asked for this one to be published, but we can more largely understand that it's important that somebody did and that it exists in a whole collection. So it's an uncurated collection.
What was the
Just-
date of that card?
This is about 1921.
Thank you.
And I just have a short, I think just only two other examples here of expressions of the African American experience in the 20th century. This is from a set of postcards of the interior of the National Malleable Castings Company in Indianapolis, Indiana. And you can see the far left there, this particular one is the colored men's dressing room. In this series, there's also the colored women's dressing room, and there's also the white men's dressing room and the white women's dressing room. And one of the things that's curious about them is there is really no difference in the facilities. It's not like the white dressing rooms were fancier or nicer. They're just segregated. So segregation as a kind of a segregation per se on its own merits is documented in postcards and in this collection as well. There's another. Should we ask what? I don't care one way or the other. Where's Jackie? Do you want me to entertain questions now, or should I get through it? It doesn't matter to me.
Whatever's most comfortable.
We'll go through it.
Go through it, go through it.
Okay, let's go through it. Let's have hands. I think the go through it wins. Okay. I also have this one, which is 1925. And this was also printed by the Teich company. So in this case, the client was the KKK. When it was more broad, overtly acceptable to have activity. But on a lighter note, we have everything under the sun. This beautiful Wiener Werkstatt image introduces just a short section that expresses how much of visual culture and just culture, fashion, what people were interested in are expressed in postcards. Now, this next section is not just what the Teich company printed. It goes now a little bit more broadly into what's in the Teich postcard archives. I'll comment a little bit more specifically on this particular image in a minute, but this is a Wiener Werkstatt card from Austria, from Vienna. And this is not. Much later, from the early 1960s, this wonderful image. The client for this was the car upholstery manufacturer. So this was actually not to the retail customer, but it would have been a postcard that a salesman for the upholstery company would have given out to show something of the product. And going a little bit further into the 1960s is this fabulous, printed by Teich, image of what the fashion was like in that time. And the Teich company also did hundreds of thousands of jobs advertising products. I just brought two this evening. So these would have been to the retail market, not within the wholesale market. This one is for a throat lozenge. Here we go. And this one this is for the Scrabble company. The kids are playing Scrabble there. This is exactly what my home looked like. I grew up in this home, and that's me and my brother Doug. And just one image of the great, iconic, so-called large letter postcards, also mostly from the linen era of postcards. But these really are iconic. And the Teich company, a couple of different publishers published them, but the Teich company published most of them. And the original art files for these also exist in the collection, which shows exactly how these large letter postcards were made. So now I'm floating away a little bit to the non-printed postcard. None of what I'm going to show here in this short section printed postcards, but they're rather what are referred to by postcard collectors as real photo postcards. But they're actual photographs printed on a 3.5 by 5.5 piece of paper. So each individual one would have had to be printed by a photographic printer as a photograph. These are important because they show events such as this. This is a collapse of a bridge in Pennsylvania. And this one, oh no, this is actually not a real photo postcard. This is printed by the Teich company. It's the destruction of alcohol in front of the Montgomery County Courthouse in Independence, Kansas in 1913 during Prohibition. And this one, Christmas 1906, what we found in our stockings. And then these are important to me because these are real photo postcards, and the man on the left-hand side is my father. And it's taken, as you see, in New York. He's about to ship out during World War II. He served in the Pacific in combat. And then this is his father, my grandfather, on this side. And
Also a type postcard?
no, these are real photo postcards. These are not type. The Teich company did not print portrait postcards. But I would say that I'm going to say that everybody in this room, if they have any sizable collection of photographs of their family going back, just all you have to go back to is 1900. Look at the size of them, and some of them are going to be 3.5 by 5.5 inches, and they're going to be postcards, whether they're written on and used as postcards or not. Because in the case of my father, obviously he's visiting Rockefeller Center, so there's someone who has a concession up there to take this, and still probably does today. On this side, this is evidence of a very prominent business during the early 20th century when itinerant photographers would go around the country and stop for a few days and set up a studio let's go back to Decatur, Illinois, and they might be there for a week, and that would be probably the only way you could get a studio portrait of yourself or your family or your baby or whatever it was. And then they would move on. And in fact, on the back of this postcard of my grandfather, it doesn't actually say, it's not written as a postcard. He wrote all the way across it and said who he had sent them to. It's written to my grandmother, and then it says I sent one to Aunt May, and I sent one to, but he didn't send them as postcards. He must have sent them in an envelope. And this is not a member of my family, but and this is not printed by the Kurt Teich company, because this is also a real photo postcard, obviously of Benito Mussolini. And I'll read this to you so you don't have to struggle to see if you can get through it. It says, this is 1921. This is a recent, you can follow along though if you start from the top. This is a recent photograph of Mussolini, a strong face, but not the brutal one some caricatures make of it. Mussolini's mother taught him to read when he was 6. When he was 9, she insisted, notwithstanding his father's indifference, that he should be put into a boys' school. He had a few terms in a normal school at Bologna and a few in the university at Lausanne. He is a great student of history, political economy, and languages. Of these last, he speaks 4. And at 38, he is leading Europe, some say the world. So that's a bit chilling. But interesting, isn't it? That it's on a postcard, it's printed probably in a large volume as a sort of form of advertisement for Mussolini. We don't know who the client was for this.
So this is not a type.
Correct. This is
one
not
of the other collections that you've got. Yeah.
He's asking if it is or isn't a Teich postcard. I'll float back and forth now. I won't refer. I'll tell you if you ask. But any real photo postcard would not have been printed by the Teich company. I'll put it to you that way. That's one way to detect it pretty easily. So just a brief section here about what I touched on earlier about the postcard. And actually, I was talking to Susan. Susan, raise your hand. I was talking to Susan earlier about how postcards have changed so little in the time they've been useful to humans. and since the time they were invented, they still, even though we don't send them in the great numbers that they were once sent, but they still are a confluence of communication in writing with a stamp. So there's an activity imbued in that stamp that is going to travel. It's going to go out of your hands. You're going to write it, and then you're going to put it in the hands of someone else, the postal service you trust. And you're doing it at a point in time, and you're communicating with someone at a distance from you. And there's a picture on it. So all of that is a gathering together of place and of emotion and of connection at a distance, and both in the present and in the future, as well as imagery. This beautiful image from 1910 in one of the parks in Paris, looking at a puppet show. But let's see, let me go back. But the idea of human experience and how it's recorded on a postcard sometimes transcends time in quite an interesting way. This one was written in 1907, and it says, "Dearest Pearl, yesterday it was a very clear day in Paris, and we had quite a good time in the afternoon. We went to the very top of La Tour Eiffel." And this one, which was sent in 1999, and it says mostly the same. "I am writing to you from the clouds. We are at the top of the Eiffel Tower." 90 years difference. Same experience. Same record. 4 different people. The 2 communicators and the 2 people to whom it was addressed. Culturally, everything was printed on postcards at some point. This was printed in 1964, a year after the Beatles came to the United States. And this one, you can't see it too terribly well in this. I was a little worried about it, but this is the Rolling Stones album Voodoo Lounge, which came out in 1994, so exactly 30 years separate, but they're very similar. It's just a band. It's a rock band, interestingly, on a postcard. I have a little section here of political cards. This is an English political card that speaks for itself. This is from the Reagan administration. It's a political cartoon. It was printed on a postcard. And I love that. "I'm charging you birds up on the hill with malfuzziness." That's really not direct enough for today, I don't think. But this one is from the first campaign of Adlai Stevenson in 1952. And this one, who is that? It's Tony Blair. And I show this to you because that's fairly recent. Tony Blair, that's fairly recent. But postcards are still used in a political way like that. Even in this, now this is 15 years old, but even in a digital age. It's 20 years old, actually. But this is a postcard, too. This postcard was published last year. I won't comment on it so as not to offend any, so as not to take any sides whatsoever. I just show it to you in this grouping of cards that shows still that there is a power in that printed image, in that small printed image that you can give, that you can hand. In fact, I'm looking at my friend and colleague Alan Teller, who gave out a little postcard. It wasn't a postcard, but it was a postcard-sized piece of information to another colleague of an exhibition he's working on. So there's something about print. And I think I'm among friends here when I say there's power in print. And postcards have come and gone. There was a golden age, and they've sort of come and gone, but they're still there, and they're still powerful, and people still use them in exactly the same way. So this almost last section shows a little bit about some of the other collections that are in the Teich archives. This just introduces this section because in the golden age of postcards, from about 1890 to the First World War, into the First World War, everyone not only sent postcards, but collected them in albums and looked at them as a sort of a parlor activity. This is just a common postcard album. There are a number of postcard albums in the Teich archives that are now here at the Newberry Library. So the first collector I want to speak about is Leonard Lauder. Leonard Lauder is the chairman emeritus of the Estee Lauder companies, and you may know that he's shown here with one of the Cubist Picasso works that he gave to the Metropolitan Museum of Art a couple of years ago. The collection that he gave was worth over $1 billion, and probably now it's $2 billion or something. But Leonard Lauder, who is arguably one of the most widely recognized fine art collectors in the world, he started collecting postcards when he was a little boy in summer camp up in the Adirondacks, and his mother would send him postcards. And eventually, he started collecting postcards of Miami. This is one of the cards from his collection of some of the Art Deco hotels down in Miami. Obviously, a real photo postcard. He's the one who collects the Wiener Werkstatt postcards. Everyone is familiar with Wiener Werkstatt? Okay, the Wiener Werkstatt existed in Vienna from 1903 until World War I. And during that time, they created works of art, some furniture, some print materials, books, and that sort of thing. But they published 925 separate postcards, and they're collected by postcard collectors now who collect very high-end art postcards, and Leonard Lauder's among them. So there's a couple of examples. This is that beautiful woman I showed you a few minutes ago. And then this one, who's not so beautiful. But if you see, this is a cafe in Vienna, and Der Literrat is the man of letters. It's translated as the man of letters. He also collects and has given his entire collection of Japanese art postcards to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, who has a very important Asian collection there. I show you just a couple of examples of those. I know you can all read this. This is from 1912. It's the Tournament of the Far Eastern Athletes, generally translated. The Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, about the same time. Isn't that beautiful? It's so luminous. And this is a postcard of the Battle of the Sea of Japan, which took place between Japan and Russia in 1905. And finally, so all of those are in the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Wiener Werkstatt postcards are in the Neue Gallery in New York City. But what is here at the Newberry Library are the Raphael Tuck, which is an English postcard publisher, the Oilette collection, Oilette, like an oil painting. And that is a term that the Raphael Tuck company coined. And I think almost all of them in that collection are painterly like this. And the intent of the Raphael Tuck company was to offer to the everyday person who could spend a penny on a postcard something that was painterly, to introduce painterliness and the idea of art and paintings to the average person. That was actually the intent of it. That collection is in the Newberry Library today. And this is just one example of it. A couple of other collections, distinguished collections. One is from this man. This is John High. He was an Actors Equity actor in New York City. He died a few years ago, but he is the one who collected the woven in silk postcards. You see one example here from the Titanic. Now, woven in silk is these postcards, what you see in the center there, and you see up there at the left, that little inset in what is otherwise kind of a frame. I'm going to step away here. You see how that's kind of a frame?
Yeah.
And there's an inset in there. Did you see that? Did you have examples of that up there?
Yes.
So these are all made on what's called a jacquard loom, which Alice mentioned very briefly upstairs is thought of as the first thinking machine, in that it was programmed with punched cards in order to do a repeating pattern with silk thread. It was first used for damask ribbon and any kind of complicated fabric that had a repeating pattern. But it was soon identified that it could be used to create pictures. And so these pictures were woven on a loom, thousands of them in a big strip, and then they were cut and mounted in cards. And one of the uses of them was when a steamship would come from Europe to the United States, you could buy what was called either a view of the ship like this, or what's referred to as a hands across the sea. And every ship that went back and forth across the Atlantic in those early decades of the 20th century had these woven in silk postcards. He collected those. He collected postcards, the work of the Czechoslovakian artist Alfons Mucha. There's another one. He collected puzzle cards. In this instance, you can see that that seems long, but if you can see that each of these individuals are postcards. And the idea here is that you would send each one individually, and eventually you'd have a scene as you received them in the mail, which I still think is such a charming idea, and I think that should come back. But so here we have an entire animal, or here we have an entire animal but made up of these separate postcards, and they were called puzzle cards. Now, my favorite series in the John High collection is this. He was very interested in opera and the theater. He was an actor, as I represented. And this is a series, an Italian series, of the different, the way these cartoon characters respond to the different movements in a musical piece. So it begins with the introduzione, and everyone is sort of listening to the music, and then this is maestro. So they're beginning to feel the music, and it concludes 10 cards later with Finale Furioso. And this was John High's favorite series. So he is, John High was a collector of wide tastes, as some collectors are. And I think I'll skip over that, but he collected things that were of interest to him. The Brian Bossier collection is one of, is your Americana curator here in the audience, Alison Wayhome? Is one of, I think, it's become a favorite here at the Newberry because it is fascinating, the imagery that Brian Bossier, just a collector, put together. His family was in the road building business in Georgia, and so he collected real photo images of the construction of roads in the early part of the century, such as the one you see here. He collected sideshow freaks. This is one of them. He collected cards that had to do with suffragettes, both pro and con, anything that had to do with suffragettes. He collected cards about cross-dressing. He collected cards about early itinerant missionaries in the United States. He collected events, especially tragic events, including lynchings and other extremely tragic events, which I won't show you or trouble you with. But this is a tornado in Omaha, Nebraska in 1913. He collected Santas. Now, I want you to put all this together if you're thinking about what he collected. It's a very peculiar and wide-ranging collection. I just have a couple of examples of some of the other important collections now at the Newberry. One is the Grant Schmalgemeyer Century of Progress collection that is a comprehensive collection of all the postcards printed by any publisher for the Century of Progress. We have the Richard Juvenile Amusement Park collection. He's also a private collector who spent years and years and years putting together a collection of everything from Coney Island to Disneyland. The wonderful Detroit Publishing Company collection that was put together by John Monroe, who's become a donor and a friend to the Newberry Library. The Detroit Publishing Company was just located in Detroit. They actually published views all around the United States, and particularly of the American West. This is Mount Shasta in 1901. And a wonderful William Henry Jackson tinted photographs of Native Americans. He's the one who collects postcards on postcards, and I'll go over these just so quickly because you saw some examples up there. There's a postcard exchange in the so-called golden age of postcards when just everybody was collecting postcards and putting them in albums. And there is that Ferris wheel, actually in situ. And I think you have a number of pictures of different interiors that show that. So I'm sure there was some manufacturer of postcard displays. This was probably, the fanciest one you could buy if you owned a store like this.
A couple of plainer ones as well.
And you have some of the plainer ones as well in the collection. And then you saw this upstairs. And then the James R. Powell Route 66 collection. I'll go through these quickly in the interest of time, but they are so fabulous. Winslow, Arizona, which always makes me think of the song. This is an important use of postcards, actually, to follow transportation routes, whether it's a river or a road or a railroad line. You can do that with postcards in a way that has a similarity of document size and type. I love this. This is the Motorant coffee shop, dining room, refined cocktail bar. Fred Lakowski, organist, will play at your request. Best courts nearby. Arts and crafts by native Navajo American Indians. And you can get gas there, all in Hobarth, Arizona, on Route 66. That's what made it so amazing. It's his kind of place. I have one example of the art files. That you had one example out, the Savoy Theater, that's upstairs, but these are really magnificent too. This is the finished postcard from 1953 of a cafe in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, just an average place. But in the Teich Archives art files, of which there are a little over 100,000 of these, this is one you're looking at, we have in a complete art file, they're not all complete, but if there's a complete one, there's a photograph of what the place actually looked like. Now, if you think about it, the salesman would have gone out on the road. They secured the job from Kirk in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, but Kirk may or may not have, he has to translate color and all of his instructions about what he wants his postcard to look like to the plant and the printers back in Chicago through imagery and through just handwritten directions. So here's what the place actually looks like. And oops, I should go back and say, look at the door here. And then look here, because there's people here in the door. And then on the back of this particular one, it says, remove farmer at door. Which I just love as an instruction, don't you? Because in 1951 in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I don't think that's a bad thing, isn't that most of your clientele? But it goes to the point of how how these later postcards, the linen postcards, were altered in ways that would sell the place differently from the earlier postcards, and certainly completely differently from the real photo postcards. So this is
They would remove the fat lady.
Yeah, did they remove a fat lady too?
They would.
Well, they probably would. And trash cans. A very common instruction in the Teich Archives art file says, put clouds in sky, without the definite article, which I always thought if I were to write a book, that would be the title. Put clouds in sky. So don't take it, anybody, in case. So this is the retouched photograph that's now been worked over at the Teich Company plant. And this is a little sketch that the art department would have sent back to Sioux Falls, South Dakota to say, okay, these are the colors, is this okay? And they would have gotten an okay back from the customer, just like you would do today with a postcard. And then importantly, I'm going to go all the way back, and you see that up here, this is just a big plain wall. We do have decorative paneling over here, but this is a big plain wall. But here, in what's been sent for approval, there's patterning as wallpaper on the wall. And here we're even getting a color indication of it. And in that art file here in the Newberry, we have a piece of that new wallpaper. And that is true of many different detail pieces that would have been sent to the Teich Company for color. Because remember, we want a color postcard, but we only have a black and white photograph in 1951. We're right on the edge there, but still. And so they would have had to send a chunk of the naugahyde from the stools or a piece of linoleum or whatever it was, and all of that exists in the art files today as well. So postcards are just everything. They're charming, they're magical, they're crazy. This one actually has applied feathers on it, so it's a hand-drawn card with applied feathers. This one is the Oofle Piffle, which, God alone knows, but it's also an art card. It's just everything in the world and sent by everyone. And so I conclude with my last three slides. This one is sent to Guillaume Apollinaire from Pablo Picasso. So it's not just you and I and Aunt Mabel and anyone else who would have sent a postcard, but it's everybody who sent postcards. And that's something else that's special about them, is that it didn't take any kind of threshold, monetary or otherwise, to use them, to enjoy them, to communicate them in exactly the same way. So their non-specialness is what makes them so special. There's two of them in this set. This is also from Picasso to Guillaume Apollinaire about 10 years later. And of course, these are very important postcards because they show the development of the Picasso style during that day. No, these are the only two I believe I've shown, but these two are just to express this idea of its postcards are for everyone, even the most exalted. But these two are not in the collection. So I leave you with this. Does anyone know what this is? Hogarth. You guys are such a smart crowd. So these are two prints actually shown side by side without a division by the printmaker, the 18th century English printmaker and artist William Hogarth. And Hogarth's purpose was not unlike that of postcard publishers in terms of the accessibility of the subject matter at the time he was printing. Accessibility to the average person. He was not playing to the connoisseur. His biographer, John Ireland, wrote of Hogarth's work that, quote, his subjects were selected for the crowd rather than the critic and explained in that universal language common to the world rather than in the lingua technica of the arts, unquote. And these words might easily have been used of the postcard publishers who were not playing to anyone in particular. They were playing to everyone. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're special. And that's all I have to say. The devil take these postcards, and thank you so much for your attention.
You ready to take some questions?
I certainly can. If you're, I know it's 20 of 8, so. Just how about 3 questions?
One question. One of the postcards you had identified as had in its lower right corner a copyright, which was not that. So the question is, are the Teich postcards in any way identifiable? I mean, obviously you can know because you proceed to what large collection, but if you find one in the store, is there a way to identify Teich postcards? Are they...
Oh, you mean, I think the question is there a way to identify a Teich postcard? Oh, well, yes.
I mean, somewhere in the corner.
It will. It'll say a number of different things. I mean, it could say you could actually do a Google search. That would probably be the easiest way to see the different logo changes over the years. But there was a C with a T over the top of it. If you see a C with a T, that's a Kurt Teich card. Sometimes, very frequently, it would just say Kurt Teich and Company or Kurt Teich Chicago. It depends on the time when it was printed. And there are a number of numbering systems that to those people who have worked with Teich postcards for many years can just identify without seeing any of those other things I just described in just the number. And the numbering system, there's a code to that we have published for many years, and I'm sure they consult it every day. So one of the, I could see a number in the bottom of one of the corners that said 1CH something something. So I know that means it was printed in 1951. They started that particular, just by example, they started that particular series in 51. They started in 1930. A meant 1930. That was the first year they started that particular sequence. B was 40s, C was 50s, etc. The H referred to it being a linen card. The number before the letter, so 1C, gave the number in the decade of that decade. So 1C would be 1951 in the linen style, and then whatever the numbers afterwards, 413 meant that job was the 413th job printed in the linen style in 1951. So, and they did start out with card 1. Just 1. 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they started, having all kinds of series that were expressive of the different styles you could order as a client, and the Newberry Library has all that information. It's pretty widely known now if you know Teich. And let's see, I'll ask her first, unless you have a follow-up on that.
Not particularly.
Okay, way in the back.
Were most of Teich's cards commissioned by a client, or did they actually publish cards and then go out and try to sell them?
So the question is, were most of the cards printed by the Teich company commissioned by was it a job that commissioned by somebody, or did the Teich company themselves try and sell postcards, like have a series of postcards? And the answer is both, more on the side of printing jobs, certainly in the early years. But they did print a small number of, I would say kind of unsuccessfully, trying to promote cards to a general audience. I didn't bring any of them tonight because they're not very interesting, quite honestly. They don't have all of the significance that these other things have. It would be maybe, some comic cards. Some comic cards. Actually, there are comic cards, especially in the Lennon years, that they would have tried to sell to a client, like a five and dime. So the five and dime is going to order this series of the town, but then they might get them to order this funny comic series too. It was a smaller part of what they did.
I think my question is related to that one. What was the economic setup for these cards? It really seems like they went to the client and said, "Want a postcard to your cafe? We'll be happy to do it for you." How much of it was done on spec? I mean,
so the question is how much of this was done on spec, and I would say that my thinking on that is that almost none of it. Almost none of it. I would say, we know because in the Newberry collection there are examples of the salesman's sample books. So a salesman would have a territory, like any national company. You're selling linoleum, you're selling postcards. And you'd have like a big expando folder with views of all the different styles, and then the salesman would, and they were all men, I don't believe there's a single female salesperson. So the salesman would go in with, Decatur views, and So I think it was all jobs, and you secured the job, whatever the financial setup was, you got whatever the money was, and then when it was successfully printed, I could go all night. I just know that we're...
thank you.
That's it? Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It is our custom and pleasure to thank you for the wonderful presentation with one of the books that we've published, signed by everyone in attendance tonight.
No kidding.
So thank you very much.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
And I just want to say really fast, there's an object in the Teich archives that's so charming. It's in the Teich family papers, and it's a handkerchief. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, but it's a handkerchief signed by many important Chicago industrialists, including, the only one I can think of is Oscar Mayer is on there, and there's some other, I know. But they were friends of the Teichs, and they would come to dinner at their fabulous mansion on Lake Michigan up in Glencoe. And they would have everyone sign the handkerchief, and then it was embroidered on top of it. And so this is sort of similar. So thank you so much.